My name is Charles Woodward, and by most standards, I am a successful man. I've built a business empire. My name commands respect in New York's elite circles, and my life is filled with luxuries most people can only dream of. Yet, behind all the shiny facades lies a truth I rarely admit. I am utterly alone. My heart hardened long ago. After years of failed relationships, betrayal, and disappointment, I concluded that love was a fantasy for other people, not for someone like me. Every woman who entered my life seemed more enamored with my wealth than with me. Eventually, I stopped trying to let anyone in. But as I stood at the window of my penthouse, staring out at the city that never sleeps, I felt the weight of time. I needed an heir, someone to carry on my name, my legacy. But creating a family for that purpose? No, I couldn't bring myself to go through the entanglements of love again. That winter morning, I decided to take a rare walk through the streets. My driver was ready to take me to my office when I spotted her. A woman with auburn hair that peeked out from beneath a worn hat stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue. Her frail figure was swallowed by an oversized coat, and in her hands, she held a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Lost. Anything helps." Something about her made me pause. Her eyes, they weren't hollow like those of so many others I had passed before. They were the eyes of someone who was fighting but losing the battle. I ordered the driver to stop and stepped out of the car. She glanced at me with suspicion, her body stiffening as if ready to bolt the moment I came closer. I offered her a meal at a nearby cafe. She hesitated, staring at me as if trying to decipher whether this was some cruel trick. Finally, she nodded. We sat in a small corner booth of the cafe, and I watched her devour a bowl of soup and bread as though it was her first meal in days. Her name was Antoinette. She told me she was from France, a once aspiring artist who had dreamed of making it in the art world. But life had not been kind. A series of failures, mounting debt, the death of her mother, and a string of toxic relationships had led her here, to the streets of New York City, homeless and lost. She spoke quietly, carefully choosing her words, as if revealing too much might somehow make things worse. And then I said it. "I want you to have my child," I told her, my voice steady. She froze, her spoon clinking softly against the edge of the bowl. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to carry my child," I repeated. "I will give you everything you could possibly need: housing, medical care, financial security. In exchange, you will give me an heir." Her face turned pale, her expression a mix of disbelief and something close to anger. "This is some kind of joke, right?" she asked, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. "No," I said, meeting her gaze directly. I explained my proposal in detail. It would be a strictly business arrangement. There would be no emotional entanglements, no obligations beyond the pregnancy. Once the child was born, she would be free to go with a substantial sum of money to start a new life. I would take full responsibility for the child, and she would never want for anything during the pregnancy. Antoinette stared at me, her expression unreadable as she processed my words. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing the absurdity of my offer against her current reality. "I know this sounds unorthodox," I added, sliding my business card across the table. "But think about it. Take your time. If you decide this is something you want, call me." I stood and left the cafe, leaving her to her thoughts. As I walked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed a line I never thought I would. It was a risk, a calculated one, but something about Antoinette told me she was exactly the person I needed. It was a week before I heard from her again. The phone call came on a quiet evening as I was sitting in my office, going over financial reports. The number was unknown, but I recognized her voice the moment she spoke. "This is Antoinette," she said softly. "I've thought about your offer." My heart, usually so steady, felt an unexpected surge of anticipation. "And," I prompted, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I don't know if I trust you," she admitted, "but I don't have many options, and what you're offering, it's more than I ever thought I'd have again. I'll do it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with resignation but also a flicker of hope. I gave her clear instructions to meet my lawyer the next day to discuss the terms of the contract. I wanted this to be as transparent as possible, not just for her, but for me. I wasn't about to let emotions or misunderstandings complicate things. The next morning, I waited at the lawyer's office when she arrived. She looked different. Not polished or glamorous, but there was something new in her demeanor. She'd showered, her hair was brushed, and she wore a plain but clean coat I assumed she'd gotten with the advance money I'd provided after our first meeting. She glanced at me nervously before sitting across from me. My lawyer, Tom, went over the details carefully. The contract was clear. Antoinette would live in a house I owned, close to the city but far from the public eye. All her medical expenses and living needs would be covered. After the child was born, she would receive a substantial sum of money and would have no further obligations or rights regarding the child unless she chose to stay involved. "It's thorough," she murmured, her eyes scanning the pages. "Do you have any questions or concerns?" I asked. She hesitated, then looked up at me. "Why me?" The question caught me off guard. I had no answer that wouldn't sound cold or calculated. Why her, indeed? Was it her eyes, her presence, the quiet strength beneath her broken exterior? Or was it simply fate? "You seemed like the right person," I replied, keeping my tone even. "You need a fresh start and I need an heir. It's mutually beneficial." She nodded slowly, not entirely convinced but willing to move forward. She signed the papers with a hand that trembled only slightly. The house I chose for Antoinette was in upstate New York, a beautiful, sprawling property with enough space to ensure her comfort and privacy. I visited a week later to check in on her. She greeted me at the door, wearing simple jeans and a sweater. She looked better, healthier. "This place is overwhelming," she admitted, glancing around the luxurious interior. "I've never had so much space before." "You'll get used to it," I said, walking past her into the living room. "How are you feeling about everything?" "I feel like I've stepped into someone else's life," she said honestly. "But it's nice not to be cold or hungry for once." I stayed longer than I'd planned, sitting with her over tea. She told me more about her past. Her childhood in a small French village, her dream of becoming a painter, the string of misfortunes that had brought her here. She spoke with an openness that surprised me, and for the first time in years, I found myself truly listening to someone. As the weeks went on, I visited more frequently. At first, it was purely out of obligation. I needed to ensure she was cared for. But gradually, those visits became something I looked forward to. There was a quiet warmth in her presence, something grounding that I hadn't realized I craved. One day, during one of our now regular tea conversations, she looked at me with a curious expression. "Why don't you have anyone in your life?" she asked. The question struck a nerve. I sipped my tea slowly before answering. "I've had people," I said, "but they've all wanted something from me: money, power, connections. No one has ever wanted me for me." She studied me for a long moment, then said, "That's sad." "It's reality," I replied, but her words lingered, unsettling something deep within me. For the first time, I wondered if this arrangement, cold, calculated, transactional, was really all I wanted. Then came the news that changed everything. It was during a routine checkup at the doctor's office. I accompanied her, as I always did, to ensure she had the best care. The doctor's smile widened as he looked at the ultrasound. "Well, Mr. Woodward, Ms. Antoinette," he said, turning the screen toward us. "It seems congratulations are in order. You're having triplets." Antoinette gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Triplets. Not one heir, but three. I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, I reached out and placed a hand on hers. "You're not alone in this," I said firmly. "We'll get through it together." Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, something shifted. The walls I had so carefully built around myself began to crack. This wasn't just about an heir anymore. This was about her, about us, and about the family we were unknowingly beginning to create. The drive back from the doctor's office was quiet. Antoinette sat in the passenger seat, her hands nervously twisting together, her gaze fixed on the rolling countryside beyond the window. I had never seen her look so vulnerable. Triplets. It was a word that echoed in my mind like a distant bell, each chime reverberating louder than the last. 3 lives, she whispered finally, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled. How am I supposed to care for 3 lives when I've barely been able to care for my own? You won't be doing it alone, I replied firmly, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. You'll have everything you need. The best care, the best resources, the best. That's not what I mean, she interrupted, turning to face me. Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, searched mine. I mean, what kind of mother will I be? What do I have to offer them? I glanced at her, startled by the depth of her fear. I wanted to say something reassuring, but the words stuck in my throat. What kind of father would I be? A cold, detached provider? A man too consumed by his work and wealth to give them what they needed most? For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt about the path I had set us on. In the weeks that followed, our lives shifted. Antoinette began to embrace her pregnancy in small, tentative ways. She painted the nursery walls in soft, calming colors, a pale lavender for one, a gentle mint green for another, and a light sandy beige for the third. I watched her work late into the evenings, her brushstrokes deliberate and precise, as if pouring her heart into every detail. She never talked about the babies in terms of the contract anymore. They weren't just your children, as she had referred to them in the beginning. Slowly, quietly, they were becoming our children. I found myself drawn to her in ways I hadn't expected. She wasn't just a surrogate anymore. She was Antoinette, the woman who hummed quietly while she painted, who laughed softly when I stumbled over French phrases she taught me, who cried late at night when she thought I wasn't listening. One evening, as I returned to the house from a long day at the office, I found her sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the star-filled sky. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside her. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure whether to join her. But something about her solitude called to me, and I stepped out into the crisp night air. Couldn't sleep? I asked, taking a seat beside her. She shook her head. The babies keep kicking. It's like they're already fighting for space. I chuckled softly, imagining the chaos that awaited us. I suppose that's a good sign. Strong and healthy. She smiled faintly, but her expression quickly turned serious. Charles? Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you want love? Her voice was quiet but insistent. When you proposed this arrangement, it was so clinical, like you were trying to avoid something. I looked away, my gaze fixed on the dark horizon. The question hit closer to home than I cared to admit. Love complicates things, I said finally. It makes people unpredictable. It creates expectations, demands, and eventually, it ends in disappointment. That's a sad way to live, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Maybe, I admitted, but it's also safe. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, You're wrong. Love isn't safe, but it's the only thing worth risking everything for. Her words unsettled me. I had spent my entire life building walls to protect myself from the vulnerability she spoke of. Yet, here she was, this fragile yet resilient woman, challenging everything I believed. As the months passed, Antoinette's belly grew, and so did the bond between us. I accompanied her to every doctor's appointment, ensuring she had the best care money could buy. But it wasn't just about the babies anymore. I began to care for her in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself looking forward to our late-night talks, to the sound of her laughter, to the way her eyes lit up when she felt one of the babies kick. One evening, as we sat together in the nursery, she placed my hand on her belly. Feel that? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. I nodded, my heart swelling as I felt the tiny movement beneath my palm. They're strong, I said, my voice soft. She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. They'll need you, Charles. Not just your money or your name. They'll need you. The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. For so long, I had believed that providing for them would be enough. But in that moment I realized how much more they would need, and how much I would have to change to give it to them. And then came the scare. It was late at night when Antoinette woke me with a frantic call. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her voice filled with panic. "The babies. I feel something's not right." My chest tightened as I rushed to her side, helping her into the car and speeding to the hospital. The minutes felt like hours as we waited for the doctor to examine her. She gripped my hand tightly, her face pale and her breathing shallow. The doctor eventually assured us that the babies were fine, but Antoinette would need to stay on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but it was followed by a deeper realization. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her or the babies. That night, as she lay resting in her hospital bed, I sat beside her, holding her hand. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something I had long buried. Fear. Fear of losing her, of losing them, of being alone again. And beneath that fear, a growing realization that this woman, this unexpected force in my life, had become far more than I had ever intended. Antoinette's time on bed rest shifted everything. The house became quieter, more intimate. I spent less time at work, instead bringing her books, meals, and whatever comforts she needed. At first, she tried to maintain her independence, but soon even she had to admit defeat. "You're hovering," she said one day, a faint smile playing on her lips as I adjusted the pillows behind her back. "Just ensuring my investment is well cared for," I joked, though the words felt wrong the moment they left my mouth. Her smile faded, and I felt the weight of my own detachment. But how could I explain to her that she had become so much more to me than just the mother of my children? The words felt trapped, heavy, and unformed. One evening, I found her sitting in the nursery, staring at the half-painted walls. She shouldn't have been out of bed, but I didn't scold her. Instead, I sat down beside her, letting the silence stretch between us. "Do you ever wonder what they'll be like?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every day," I admitted, surprising even myself. "I wonder if they'll look like you." Her head turned toward me, her expression softening. "I think they'll be stubborn. Like you." I chuckled, the sound foreign but welcome. "You're not wrong." For the first time, it felt like we were sharing something beyond the arrangement. A hope for the future that neither of us dared to speak out loud. As the weeks passed, my feelings for Antoinette deepened, though I kept them buried. She deserved more than a man who didn't know how to express himself. Yet every touch, every laugh, every shared moment only made it harder to maintain the distance I had once insisted upon. One night, as I stood by her door watching her sleep, I realized the truth. I wasn't just afraid of love. I was terrified of losing it. Antoinette's health stabilized, but the looming birth of the triplets brought a new tension. The days felt shorter, the hours heavier with anticipation. We both knew the arrangement was nearing its conclusion, though neither of us spoke about what would come next. One afternoon, as I helped her with a stack of baby clothes, she held up a tiny onesie and smiled. "It's strange," she said softly, running her fingers over the fabric. "I never imagined I'd have this. A life growing inside me. Let alone 3. I hesitated before answering. "Do you regret it?" Her gaze flicked to mine, thoughtful. "No, but I didn't expect to care this much." Her words struck a chord. She wasn't just talking about the babies, though she didn't elaborate. Neither did I. Later that night, as I worked in my study, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. To the way her laugh seemed to fill the house, to the way she talked to the unborn children like they could hear her. The walls I had built around myself felt thinner with every passing day. I found myself standing outside her door again, the moonlight spilling into the hallway. I knocked lightly. "Charles?" she called, her voice drowsy but warm. I stepped inside. She was sitting up in bed, her hair loose around her shoulders, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I just wanted to check on you," I said, though it wasn't the whole truth. She smiled faintly. "I'm fine. They're calm tonight." I sat in the chair beside her bed, unsure of what I was doing but unable to leave. Antoinette, I began, the words catching in my throat. She tilted her head, waiting. You've changed this house, I said finally. You've changed me. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt electric. But then she lowered her gaze, brushing her fingers over her belly. I'm not sure what that means for us, Charles. Neither was I. But I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to let her go. The day the triplets arrived began like any other, with the quiet hum of routine. Antoinette had been unusually calm that morning, though her body showed all the signs of strain. I had just stepped out to take a call when I heard her yell my name. By the time I rushed back inside, she was gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, her face pale, her breath short and panicked. Charles, it's time, she said, her voice trembling. I wasted no time. The drive to the hospital was a blur of speeding lights and quick reassurances. She clutched my hand the entire way, her grip so tight it left marks on my skin, but I didn't care. The delivery room was chaos. Doctors and nurses moved in a blur, their voices overlapping as they prepared for what was labeled a high-risk birth. Antoinette's face was contorted with pain, but her eyes stayed locked on mine as if drawing strength from my presence. I'm scared, she whispered as another contraction racked her body. So am I admitted, my voice low. But you're stronger than anyone I've ever known. You'll get through this. Hours passed in what felt like an eternity. Then, one by one, they arrived, 3 perfect, tiny lives that filled the room with cries and the overwhelming sense of something greater than myself. I held my breath as the nurses swaddled each of them, placing them briefly in Antoinette's arms before setting them in their bassinets. Her exhaustion was palpable, but when she looked at me, her eyes glistened with tears. Charles, she said softly, they're beautiful. I couldn't find the words to respond. My chest ached with something I hadn't felt in years, pure, unfiltered joy. Later that night, after the chaos had settled, I stood by the nursery window in the hospital, looking down at the triplets. They were so small, their tiny fists curled, their faces peaceful. I couldn't believe they were mine, ours. Antoinette was asleep, recovering in her room, and I found myself unable to leave the nursery. One of the nurses approached me. You're a lucky man, she said with a kind smile. I am, I replied, though the weight of the truth behind those words hadn't fully settled yet. Lucky didn't begin to cover it. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about my legacy or the empire I'd built. I was thinking about Antoinette, about the children she had brought into this world, about the life we had unintentionally created together. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. The next morning, as I walked into Antoinette's hospital room, she was awake, holding one of the babies close to her chest. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and contentment. Meet your daughter, she said softly, holding the tiny bundle toward me. I took the baby into my arms, my hands surprisingly steady for someone who had spent his life avoiding vulnerability. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and in that instant, I knew I would never be the same. They'll need names, I said after a moment, glancing down at Antoinette. She smiled faintly. I think we should decide together. Together. The word lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Whatever this was between us, it was no longer just a contract or an arrangement. It was something much deeper, something neither of us was ready to define, but both of us felt. Bringing the triplets home felt surreal. The house, once a space of quiet isolation, was now alive with the sounds of soft cries, cooing, and the steady hum of activity. Antoinette had moved into the larger bedroom next to mine, and we spent most nights awake together, taking shifts to care for the babies. It didn't take long for me to realize that nothing about this would be easy. 3 infants meant endless diapers, constant feedings, and a revolving door of nurses and caretakers to assist. Yet, in the chaos, I found myself oddly content. There was a beauty in the madness, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. One evening, after the house had finally settled into a rare moment of quiet, I found Antoinette in the nursery. She was rocking one of the babies, our son, while softly humming a lullaby. The moonlight streamed through the window, bathing her in a glow that made her look almost ethereal. "You're good at this," I said, leaning against the doorframe. She smiled, though it was faint. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just barely holding it together. But when I look at them," she trailed off, her gaze fixed on the tiny boy in her arms, "it's like they're worth all of it. Every struggle, every mistake." I stepped closer, my hands resting on the crib beside her. "You're not in this alone, Antoinette." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was a charged silence between us. "I know," she said softly, "but it's hard to believe sometimes. I keep waiting for this to end, for you to remind me it's just a contract." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "It's not just a contract anymore," I admitted, the truth spilling out before I could stop it. "You're more than that to me. They're more than that." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing mine briefly. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. In the weeks that followed, we fell into a rhythm. We spent more time together. Long walks around the property with the babies, quiet moments in the nursery, and evenings talking about everything and nothing. The walls I had built around myself began to crumble, and I could see Antoinette letting her guard down as well. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to me with a question I hadn't expected. "Do you ever regret this?" she asked. "Regret what?" "All of it. Choosing me. Deciding to have children this way." I shook my head, the answer coming more easily than I anticipated. "No, not for a second." Her eyes searched mine, and for the first time I saw hope there. "I never thought I'd be a mother," she said quietly. "And I never thought I'd meet someone who'd see me as anything more than broken." "You're not broken," I said, my voice firm. "You're the strongest person I know, and the best decision I've ever made." Her breath caught, and I realized how close we were sitting. It would have been so easy to close the gap, to let the growing feelings between us finally surface. But she looked away, and the moment passed. Later that night, I stood outside her door again, the same pull drawing me back. I thought about knocking, about telling her everything I had been holding back. But something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or the lingering remnants of the walls I'd spent my life building. Instead, I turned and walked away, hoping that the right moment would come, and praying I wouldn't miss it when it did. The right moment came sooner than I expected. A few weeks later, the triplets were just over 2 months old, and the house had settled into a delicate rhythm. The baby's cries still punctuated the nights, but Antoinette and I had grown into the roles of caregivers, partners in the chaos. But even as we worked side by side, the unspoken feelings between us hung heavy, a quiet tension neither of us dared to address. One rainy evening, after the babies were asleep, Antoinette surprised me by inviting me to share a glass of wine in the living room. She looked radiant, even in her exhaustion, her hair loosely tied back, her cheeks flushed from a long day. We sat across from each other, the sound of rain pattering against the windows filling the silence. "This feels normal," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. "Like a real family." I smiled faintly. "We are a family." Her eyes flicked to mine, searching. "Are we, though? Or are we just two people pretending to be something for the sake of these babies?" I set my glass down, leaning forward. "Antoinette, I don't pretend. Not with you, not with them. What we've built here, it's real." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're so hard to figure out, Charles. Some days, you're this distant man with walls so high I can't see over them. And then other days," she trailed off, her voice trembling. "Other days, you look at me like I'm the only person in the world." I didn't hesitate this time. I stood and moved to sit beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. "You are," I said quietly. "You've been the only person in my world for months now. I just didn't know how to say it." She stared at me, her lips parted in shock. "Charles, I thought I could keep this simple," I continued, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I thought I could have an heir without all the complications of love. But then you came into my life, and everything changed. You changed. Her hands trembled as she set her glass aside. You mean that? I nodded, my heart pounding. I've spent my whole life running from anything that made me feel vulnerable. But with you, I don't want to run anymore. I want to build something real. With you. Tears spilled over her cheeks, but she was smiling. I've wanted to hear that for so long, she whispered. I've been so afraid this would end and I'd lose everything. Lose you. You'll never lose me, I said, taking her hands in mine. I want us to be more than a contract, more than a family by circumstance. I want us to choose each other. That night, for the first time, the walls between us came down completely. We talked for hours, sharing every fear, every hope, every dream we hadn't dared to voice before. It was as if the months of unspoken feelings had finally spilled over, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. The house felt lighter, warmer, filled with more than just the sounds of the babies. It was filled with laughter, with quiet moments of affection, with a sense of belonging I had never known. Months later, on a sunny spring morning, Antoinette and I stood in the backyard, watching the triplets play on a blanket in the grass. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and for the first time in my life, I felt complete. Do you ever think about how this all started? She asked, her voice tinged with wonder. Every day, I admitted. And every day, I thank whatever twist of fate brought you into my life. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with love. I used to think I was lost, she said softly. But maybe I just needed someone to help me find my way. You found your way, I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. And in the process, you helped me find mine. As I held her close, watching our children laugh and reach for the sky, I knew we had created something far greater than either of us had ever imagined. What had started as a cold transaction had become a life filled with warmth, love, and the promise of a future we would face together.